Lutchmiah. I work here at Wikborg, Rein, Singapore, having recently moved from London, and I'm in charge of the transactional practice. And over the last 4 to 5 years, a lot of the work has been on transboundary movements for recycling, mainly of drilling rigs, but also some vessels. So today's presentation is on transboundary movements for recycling. And there are two regimes. Most of you will be familiar with the Hong Kong Convention, which of course seeks to minimize and eliminate to the extent possible risks to human health and to the environment, but it does not address the transboundary movement of assets for recycling. And unfortunately also the Hong Kong Convention is not yet in force. On the other hand, the Basel Convention, which addresses transboundary movements for recycling, is in force, although it isn't as often looked at in my experience. And what the Basel Convention does is it seeks to regulate transboundary movements for recycling, and it imposes a prior informed consent regime so that the states of export, import, and any transit states need to approve the movement before it can go ahead. Waste under the Basel Convention is defined in such a way that a ship becomes waste from the minute the owner forms the intention to recycle it. And of course, that intention is formed much earlier than the actual sale of the vessel for recycling. And marine assets, as I'm sure Rakesh will tell you in a little bit. Oh, thank you. Marine assets almost always contain quantities of hazardous materials such as asbestos, PCBs, and mercury. So a vessel for recycling will almost always constitute a hazardous waste. And movements of hazardous waste which are undertaken without prior informed consent constitute illegal traffic. 187 states out of 193 UN members are parties to the Basel Convention. So it's effective, apologies, it's effective in most jurisdictions. A notable exception is the United States of America, which signed the Basel Convention in 1990, but has yet to ratify it. So the Basel Convention is an agreement between states. It's not directly applicable to private parties. Each state party to the Basel Convention is required to implement it in its own local laws, and it can implement it with more onerous requirements. So owners of end-of-life marine assets need to do a lot of local due diligence to understand and manage the conflicting requirements in the states of export, import, and any transit states. And now I'll move on to transboundary movements of non-EU flagged marine assets out of the EU. So the EU implemented the European Waste Shipment Regulation in order to implement the Basel Convention within European Union law. And the European Waste Shipment Regulation applies to all waste, whether or not hazardous. It's directly applicable in all EU member states and bans the export of waste from the EU for disposal outside of the EU or the EFTA and for recovery to any location outside of the OECD. Once an intention to scrap has been formed, and like I said, that's usually well in advance of any contract for sale, the transboundary movement originating from an EU member state can only be undertaken in compliance with the European Waste Shipment Regulation unless the marine asset is EU flagged. And I'm sure you're all aware of the recent decision by the District Court of Rotterdam in the sea trade matter that ships designated for recycling, even if they are still commercially trading and carrying a cargo until their final destination, are still waste. The EU has also more recently implemented the European Ship Recycling Regulation. It came into force fully as of the 31st of December last year, and it seeks to implement the standards of the Hong Kong Convention in advance of the Hong Kong Convention coming into force. It also controversially seeks to modify the application of the Basel Convention in the EU. The ship recycling regulation has a direct impact on ships flying the flag of an EU member state, unless such ships are excluded from its scope, and I'll go into that a little bit later. And as from the 31st of December 2018, ships flying the flag of an EU member state fall outside of the scope of the European Waste Shipment Recycling Regulation and are only permitted to be recycled at one of the approved yards on the European list. So, like I said, whilst most EU-flagged commercial vessels fall within the scope of the European Ship Recycling Regulation, these are the vessels that would fall outside the scope, so it's quite limited. And for these vessels which fall outside of the scope of the Ship Recycling Regulation, they will remain subject to the Waste Shipment Regulation. So as a result of the European Ship Recycling Regulations, there are now two different regimes that apply to EU and non-EU flagged vessels, resulting in substantially different rules applying to ships going for recycling from the EU. And this is solely because of the difference in flag. Some examples are, for example, a non-EU flagged vessel cannot undertake any transboundary movement once the intention to recycle has been formed without prior consent. Whereas a EU-flagged vessel can continue to trade and move freely, at least within the EU, even though an intention to recycle has been formed. With regard to recycling yard locations, a non-EU flagged vessel can be exported from an EU member state for recycling in the OECD only. So this limits the choice of yards based on location rather than based on sound environmental practices and capabilities. An EU-flagged vessel, as I said earlier, must be recycled at one of the yards on the European list, and these yards are chosen based on their sound environmental capabilities. A non-EU vessel cannot, for example, be exported. A non-EU flagged vessel cannot be exported from the EU to India for recycling. But if an Indian yard were to be added to the European list in future, then an EU flagged vessel could in future technically be exported from the EU to India for recycling. And then in terms of the actual regulatory approval process, the process for non-EU flagged vessels is much more complicated and time-consuming compared to the process for EU-flagged vessels. So there's quite a divergence in regimes as a result solely of the vessel's flag. These are the scary slides, the seller beware. So the European Ship Recycling Regulation seeks to exempt the majority of EU-flagged commercial ships from compliance with the EU Waste Shipment Regulation, but it doesn't provide any exemption for other prohibitions which are relevant to ships going for recycling, such as prohibitions on the export of ozone-depleting substances, mercury, and fluorinated greenhouse gases. The legality and the effectiveness of the EU's attempted exemption of EU-flagged ships from compliance with the European Waste Shipment Regulation and the Basel Convention regime in general is questionable in some respects. For example, the Ship Recycling Regulation will not exempt the owner of an EU-flagged ship which is physically located or transiting through a state outside of the EU, and it will need to comply with the domestic legislation there, which will be based on the Basel Convention. As a way of a practical example, a Maltese-flagged vessel, which is sold as is in Singapore for recycling, will be subject to Singapore's laws implementing the Basel Convention. However, the owner of that EU-flagged asset will also need to ensure that that ship is only recycled at one of the yards on the European list. So to the extent that the EU-flagged vessel is exported from a non-EU jurisdiction, then the ship recycling regulation seems ineffective in replacing the Basel Convention regime. And if it's exported from an EU jurisdiction to a non-EU jurisdiction, then compliance with the ship recycling regulation is only half the story. The movement will also need to comply with the importing country's regulations, and if it doesn't, then there's a risk that the country of import will exercise take-back obligations and force the owner to take the asset back to where it originated from. In terms of seller beware, a seller is the owner of the vessel before it becomes a waste, because it's designated for recycling, is considered the producer of such waste, and therefore has the obligation to comply with the transboundary movement regime. A sale of a vessel to a third-party cash buyer for recycling will not insulate the seller from residual liabilities in the event that the buyer fails to comply with the relevant transboundary movement regime. So the seller needs to consider carefully whether to do the transboundary movement approvals themselves or delegate such approvals to the third-party buyer, but at the seller's peril. The cost of compliance with the Basel regime, yes, it is a slightly complicated process and there's a lot of paperwork, but it's, the cost of compliance is not high compared to the risks of prosecution, risks of being in breach of representations and warranties within your financing documents, your insurance, your contracts, and of course the massive risk of reputational damage to companies. So the NGOs, in particular the shipbreaking platform, has been very active in monitoring movements which could be illegal traffic, and state prosecutors have been much more active in recent years in prosecuting such illegal movements. And these are just some examples. And I'll leave it there. I think I've scared people enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much.